When I was in late middle school, like seventh or eighth grade, I got in trouble. This one time I got in trouble, and actually I got in trouble a lot growing up. I was in trouble all the time. And so if you're the parent of a kid who is in trouble a lot, be encouraged that maybe God is just giving them a lot of sermon illustrations. And so, this one time at late middle school, seventh or eighth grade, I was out with my friends doing something we shouldn't have, and I looked down at my watch and I realized that it was way past curfew. And so I start rushing home, and my plan was to sneak in the back door and just pretend like I had been there all along. And so I get home and I go to the back door and I try to open it and it is locked. And so I'm like, well, no problem. There is a window about a half story up that we always left unlocked in case my brother or my sister and I forgot our keys. And there's like bricks jutting out in the wall that we would use as footholds, and we would just climb up to that window. And so I couldn't knock on the door because then my parents would know I was late. So my plan was I'm going to go up to this window and just slide in and pretend like I had been here all along. And so I start climbing up, and I'm holding on to the windowsill. I'm about to slide up the window when I look through and I see my dad on the other side of the window. And he just takes his finger and locks the window. And so I have to climb down. He goes and lets me in the back door. And of course, I am in trouble for that. I forget how long I was grounded for that one, probably at least a week, because not only was I late and past curfew, but I was trying to deceive my parents by sneaking into the house and pretending like I had been there all along. And in John chapter 10, Jesus uses a similar metaphor. He says, "Very truly I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber." Right before this, in John chapter 9, Jesus had healed a blind man, and the blind man was healed, and we looked at that a couple weeks ago, but the Pharisees, essentially, they excommunicate this blind man for having belief in Jesus, the one who cured his sight and healed him. And so they excommunicate this blind man, and when Jesus says, anyone who enters the pen through another way is a thief or a robber, he is telling the Pharisees, hey, you are that thief and that robber. You're up to no good. Continuing on in verse 2, it says, the one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. Jesus uses a very, what would have been a recognizable metaphor back then, but to us today, it kind of gets lost just because we don't understand the way sheep pens work. And so sheep pens, a lot of times they would have the sheep pen, and multiple shepherds would keep their sheep in this pen. And so you had the gatekeeper, and he would just allow the shepherds of the sheep in the pen, and the shepherd would have their call, and just that shepherd's sheep would come to him. And sometimes the shepherd would even call his sheep by name, and so he would call out Bob, Joe, whatever, and just those sheep would come to the shepherd. And here, Jesus is comparing a good shepherd, one who knows and cares for his flock and loves his flock and even knows his flock by name, to the Pharisees, who are only interested in using the flock for their own gain. And so he's making this comparison. And unfortunately, that still happens some today in the church. There are people and church leaders and church members and Christians that are only interested in using the church and the people in their church for their own gain. If you Google the term church hurt, you'll get lots and lots of websites of people who have been hurt by the church. Hurt by the people in the church, hurt by other Christians, hurt by the leaders and pastors of the church. It seems like we can't go a week or two without hearing about some sort of scandal in the church of some leader who has sexually abused, manipulated his congregation or so forth, or their congregation. And so this church hurt is a real thing. This is Google's definition of church hurt. It says church hurt is emotional pain or trauma resulting from negative experiences in a church of faith community, often involving spiritual, emotional, or physical abuse, manipulation, or betrayal by members or leaders. Barna Research, they do a lot of research in church and religion and so forth. They came out with this study and they said that 40% of the people who leave church do so because of church hurt. And that same study said that 37% of the people who don't attend church don't attend because of some form of church hurt, either by Christians or the way churches have treated them or so forth. Church hurt is a problem in our country. And we like to think that it won't happen to us, it won't happen here, it won't happen wherever you attend. But the reality is that if you're in church long enough, you are bound to experience some form of church hurt. When I've worked for lots and lots of churches, and one of the churches I worked for right out of college, two of the ministers that I looked up to as mentors and so forth, the two of them were having an affair with each other. And at the same time, another minister of that church was embezzling like hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that really deeply hurt me, because of the lies and the manipulation that were coming my way as a result. And I didn't realize how bad it had hurt me until years later. I was in a different city, different town, and I was contemplating going to a church where one of those members now worked and becoming a member at that church. And I had to really wrestle with, can I even attend and become a member of this church with this person hurt me so badly? Church hurt is a real thing. Charles Spurgeon, he has this quote. He says, "The day we find the perfect church, it becomes imperfect the moment we join it." And this is the reason why church hurt happens, is because the church is filled with imperfect people, people who are sinners and people who are flawed, and they are only looking after themselves. And so if you are here this morning and you have experienced church hurt, man, I am so sorry you went through that. Like, that wasn't God's intention. That wasn't God's plan. Church is supposed to be a place where you feel safe and loved and welcomed, and oftentimes it is a place where you feel silenced and you feel hurt and you feel manipulated and abused. And that is not the way it is supposed to be. And so I am sorry you went through that. I think that's why Jesus, he goes on to say in John 10, verse 7, he says, "Therefore, Jesus said again, very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. And Jesus says, I am the gate. And back then, the sheep pens, they often didn't have a gate. And so the gatekeeper would literally stand and position himself at the entryway of the sheep pen and would be the gate, the living gate that protected anything evil from coming in. And so when Jesus says, I am the gate, that is what he's talking about. And we have to remember that Jesus is the gate of grace that grants healing and hope. Jesus is the gate of grace that grants healing and hope. Not only does, if you enter through Jesus as the gate, not only will you be saved, but he also grants restoration and healing and hope for you. There is this fancy church word, but it's this theology called expiation. And essentially what expiation is this idea that not only are you forgiven of your own sins and your own mistakes and your own flaws and bad habits and so forth, but you're also forgiven of the sins that are committed against you. And so a lot of times church hurt happens to us and we hold on to it because it's traumatic and it's hard and we have been seriously wounded by it. And this theology is saying, no, I have forgiven the sins that have been committed against you. You don't have to feel that shame. You don't have to feel that guilt. You don't have to feel any of that because I have forgiven the sins that have been committed against you. And this is important to understand because when we understand this, we can start to begin to heal. Because Jesus is the gate of grace that grants healing and hope and restoration. In John chapter 5, we read of another sheep gate. And so starting in verse 1, it says, after this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethsaida, which has 5 roofed colonnades. And so the sheep gate is in the wall, in the northwest wall of Jerusalem, and it was right by the temple. And this is important because the sheep gate was used because the temple would bring in the sheep through this gate that was used as sacrifices in the temple. And this is important to understand. Verse 3, it says, in these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. In your translation or your Bible, you may or may not have verse 4 there. And historians and church theologians, they think that verse 4 was probably added later because it's not found in the earliest manuscripts. And so no one's trying to trick you or anything. If you look at the footnotes, it explains it all. But verse 4 was probably added later because it gives some context to this passage. And essentially what verse 4 says is that if an angel would come and stir up the waters in the pool, and it was believed that the first person to enter the pool would be healed of whatever it was, their ailment or their suffering or whatever. And so that's what verse 4 talks about. And then verse 6, it says, when Jesus saw him laying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, do you want to be healed? Now, this seems like a foolish question to ask a invalid and a crippled man that had been there for 38 years. Jesus asked, do you want to be healed? Our assumption would be, yes, of course he wants to be healed. But the reality is that, like, Jesus asks all of us this question. He has all of us if we want to be healed. And there are times where we do not want to be healed because we are so comfortable in our sin. We are so comfortable in our bad habits. We are so comfortable in our way of life that we don't want to change and we don't want to be transformed and we do not want to be healed. And so Jesus, he asked this man, do you want to be healed? And it's not a foolish question because lots of people don't want the healing that Christ offers. And the man responds in verse 7. He says, the sick man answered him, Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going, another steps down before me. Essentially, what this man is saying is he's saying, yes, I want to be healed, Jesus, but I can't because I need help. I know someone else always steps in before me. I want to be healed, but I can't. I need help. And isn't this true for all of us? Like if we want to be healed, we can't do it on our own. We need the help of Jesus. Verse 8, it says, Jesus said to him, get up, take up your bed, and walk. And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now that day was the Sabbath. This invalid man, this crippled man for 38 years says, yes, Jesus, I want to be healed, but I need help. And Jesus, he does the miraculous, and he heals this man, and he tells him to get up and take up his bed and walk. Look what happens next. It says, so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, it is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed. But he answered them, the man who healed me, the man that said to me, take up your bed and walk. Did I? Oh, okay. They asked him, who is this man who said that to you? Take up your bed and walk. Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in the place. And so the religious leaders, they see this man that they knew he had been in the same spot for 38 years. They knew he was crippled and he couldn't walk. And they see him walking and carrying his bed. And instead of being amazed by the miracle that Jesus did of healing this crippled man, they are more concerned that he is carrying a bed. And here is what the religious leaders, they were more concerned with protecting their religion than loving the man. The religious leaders were more concerned with protecting their religion and their laws and the way they did things more than loving the man, the person that was healed. They forgot that part of the religion, part of the whole point of the religion is not to protect the religion, but to love people. They forgot that simple truth and that simple fact. You see, this man, he had been laying in this spot for 38 years. And for 38 years, he saw sheep coming through this gate being slaughtered by the religion of the day. And Jesus is saying, hey, I am a new gate, and if you walk through me, you're not going to be slaughtered, but instead, I will give you life. And even better than that, he says, I am going to be the one who gets slaughtered in your place. This man knew all too well what happened to the flock. We are reading and hearing about church hurt happening to this man. The religious leaders were more concerned about their church and their way of life and their laws than they were about this man. Continuing on in verse 14, it says, afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, see, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you. The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." This may seem like this man is kind of throwing Jesus under the bus here. Jesus just healed this man, and then he goes back to the Pharisees and the religious leaders and is like, no, it's not me. It's Jesus is the one that told me to do this. And here's where I think what I think we can get from this is that a lot of times we think that we have to have all of our ducks in a row before we can come to Jesus for healing. But that's not the case. Whether you're strong in your faith or weak in your faith, like, we can still come to Christ for healing. Like, he is the gate that gives grace and grants healing and hope, and we can come to him no matter where we are in our faith, whether we're strong in our faith, weak in our faith, or whether we have been hurting or not. And here's what Jesus understood and understands, is that sometimes hurt people hurt people. Sometimes people who have been hurt by the church and hurt by just life in general, like, sometimes they're struggling and they're hurting. And Jesus, he doesn't care. He's going to bring healing and hope and restoration regardless of how you treat him. And so what can we take away from this text and this passage this morning? What is it that God is inviting us into with this? I think a couple of things. First is he is asking you. He's asking you, do you want to be healed? Do you want to be healed and transformed from your sin and your old way of life? Do you want to be healed? And so ask yourself that question, because sometimes we are so comfortable in our sin that we would rather be sick than be healed. And so Jesus is asking you, do you want to be healed? And ask yourself that question. And genuinely look inside yourself and see what areas in your life that maybe you need to give up to God to be healed from. I think another thing that God is inviting us into, and this church already does this so well, but I think he is inviting us to commit to be a church that loves and doesn't hurt. He is inviting us to be a church that welcomes in those who have been abused or manipulated or hurt by the church, and to be a place where they can experience safety and welcoming and love. And so let's commit to, and I say let's commit to this, we already do this, but let's continue being a church that loves and a church that strives to love well and not hurt others. Thank you.
Church family, if you have experienced a hurt, if you are